I am from the Himalaya, and my home state of Uttarakhand was an integral part of the ancient trade routes from the roof of the world. The unique spiritual culture of the Trans-Himalayan region carries the deep imprint of Tibetan thought and practice. Both Andrew Quintman and Holly Gayley have given much to the scholarship and memory archives of the besieged identity of Tibet. Although I could not make it to America for this edition, I'm there with them in spirit as ever. Thank you and namaste.
Well, thank you, Namita, for that kind introduction. It's nice to have you here with us in spirit, if not in physical presence. So, and thanks to all of you for coming out, for spending the afternoon. I know it's been a long day. There's been a lot that's happened so far, but we're pleased to be here together with you. And I'm especially excited to have, as a colleague and partner in conversation, Holly Gayley. It seems like we've had a lot of collaborative work over the last few years together, and this is kind of a nice way to continue that. So we thought I'd start by just saying a word or two about Holly. Holly is an associate professor of religion in the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Colorado, but she is one of our foremost experts and most important voices in the study of contemporary Tibetan literature, and she's worked on a whole wide range of issues and topics. Her research attends to questions of sexuality and gender, of self-identity and nationhood. She has a whole list of books that you can find down in the store, but her most recent work has attended to the fascinating relationship between two prominent religious teachers, male and female, and their kind of special connection and relationship as manifested both in their biographies and in their love letters to one another. So thanks, Holly, for being here.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's really a delight. Last time we were in the steps room, we were reflecting, so we've kind of like we're upgraded to skyscapes. It's very exciting. Although I'm realizing that the Buddhist community is not here in numbers because we are competing with the Kala Chakra Tantra initiation happening in town, which is kind of hard to compete. Hard to compete. But we're so excited to be here with all of you and to be in conversation. So Andy is Associate Professor of Religion at Wesleyan University and has been and is the leading expert on the Tibetan yogin Milarepa. And not only done a new translation of the life of Milarepa, but also written a fascinating story about his biographical corpus and the evolution of that, and how the narrative gained more flesh over time until you get its apogee in Sangyang Haruka's version of his life story, which is now really become a classic of world literature. So really fascinating to see how that evolved. And Andy's also been an important proponent of the study of Buddhist texts as literature. And I feel honored to have just co-edited a volume with him called Living Treasure, Buddhist and Tibetan Studies, in honor of Janet Gyatso, one of our mentors. So that's downstairs if you're interested.
Wonderful. And so the session today, its genesis really began with this wonderful collection, a new edition, a new book that was edited, collection that was edited by Namita, called Mystics and Skeptics in Search of Himalayan Masters. This was a collection that both Holly and I contributed to, and we both contributed chapters reflecting on the lives of two important masters, Holly Yeshe Tsogyal and myself on Milarepa. Since Namita couldn't be with us here today, we thought we would sort of rethink the content of this panel and think specifically about the lives of these two Tibetan masters, Milarepa and Yeshe Tsogyal, but also not only in their lives and representations of their lives, but in their afterlives. That is the way in which the stories of their lives have resonated historically and continue to manifest in the Buddhist cultural world today. So we're going to begin by thinking a little bit about the sort of status or role and context of life writing, that is the writing of recording of the lives of masters in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And then we'll think about 2 or 3 different ways in which those stories manifest beyond the written page. So we'll think about life stories manifesting in art and ritual, in performance, and in also in the sort of contemporary Buddhist worlds today. We wanted to focus specifically on the category or the genre of life writing for a couple of reasons. One, this is a topic that both of us have a deep interest in. We both have done translation and research and analysis of the genre of Tibetan life writing. But one of the things that I think makes the Tibetan manifestation of Buddhism stand apart from other regional forms of Buddhism, say in China or in South Asia, is a specific emphasis on recording and preserving and transmitting the lives of masters from the Tibetan realm. And so there's something, I think, that we can learn about the specific ways or the specific manifestations of Tibetan Buddhism by looking at these particular kinds of narratives. So I thought, Holly, maybe we could start with thinking about Yeshe Tsogyal. And we know in general that many Tibetan life stories serve kind of dual functions. One, they tell the inspiring story of a master of the past, but they also present a kind of roadmap for how to carry out the practice of the path to awakening. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way you see that manifesting in the stories of Yeshe Tsogyal.
Okay, sure. And are you able to see the PowerPoint? Okay. So, and then let's just see. Okay, good. All right, so just so we orient towards Milarepa and Yeshe Tsogyal. Yeshe Tsogyal is one of the, or if not the, preeminent woman teacher, disciple, consort. She has a variety of roles of Tibetan Buddhism. She's part of the founding mythos of Buddhism in Tibet, an 8th century figure who played not only an important role in the myths around that period of the advent of Buddhism in Tibet, but actually in the literature that created that myth. She is somebody who's credited with actually hiding teachings by the 8th century Indian tantric master Padmasambhava across the Tibet and Himalayan landscape. So if you were here this morning at the panel about Tsering Yangzom Lama's debut novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, you might have heard the word terma, which means treasures. And this means that actually Yeshe Tsogyal's in some ways, she has blessed the entire landscape of that region. There's a kind of way that her blessing lingers. But she's also specifically a model for Buddhist women. And this is really important because there are actually few and far between Buddhist female masters who have made it into the literary record. Now, if you travel to Tibet, you hear about a lot of these. Khandroma is the title. This translates the Sanskrit Dakini, and this is really, the term that is used, the epithet that it's used for realized female masters. But they teach locally. They're well known. They're revered, but they often don't make it into the literary record. This is what sometimes is called androcentric record keeping. And so just Yeshe Tsogyal's life story being part of this lore, this mythos, is so crucial, and that her life story has been written again and again across time. And so her life story actually expresses some of women's concerns on the path to enlightenment. Just the fact that she attains enlightenment in her story, and biographical writing in Tibet is called Namtar, which is a story of complete liberation. So the fact that she is shown to win enlightenment through her own exertion and efforts and asceticism is hugely important. There's never a question in Tibet, as there was in certain periods of time in Indian Buddhism, of whether women could attain full, complete enlightenment. Right at the get-go of the founding moments of Buddhism in Tibet, there is Yeshe Tsogyal. And she also is actually a role model for exceptional women who are understood to be her emanations. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So these are some of the facets of Yeshe Tsogyal's life. She begins as an elite woman, a princess of Karchen, and the opening is very much focused on her outer life and her beauty, so how she's viewed socially, and also her attempt to extricate herself from social expectations that she would marry. And so this is a theme in women's life writing, Buddhist women's life writing, the resistance, marital resistance. And she is literally, in her stories, she sings these songs about how she wants to renounce the world and attain liberation. And then she's really forced by her family, into these marriages, and then she runs away, and then she's dragged back, and it gets very dramatic, and it's a large part of her story. But you can imagine that this already creates a cultural space for Tibetan women to choose something other than marriage, to become a nun or to become a yogini, a female renouncer, a ngakma. And so there are different versions of what happens to her next. One story has her marry the Tibetan emperor, Trisong Detsun, and then he gives her away to Padmasambhava as an offering. So very patriarchal gesture for women to be exchanged between men. But actually in the earlier version of her life, she escapes and is already meditating in a forest, completely taming all the animals. And then finally, when the army of this prince that she's been promised to comes to get her, she calls on Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche, and they fly away together. So there are different versions of this. We don't know how much of this is historical. And in a way, it doesn't matter, right? Because the truth of this, the value of this, is more important for Tibetan culture, for the stories, the narratives of Buddhism. And then she's really renowned as the consort of Padmasambhava. And consort, there's all kinds of issues we can talk about if you want, about how this term has been used and to what degree this is, patriarchal exploitation or a mutual engagement in very esoteric practices to win liberation. There's been a lot of scholarship on that. But basically, it's in this role that she is able to record Padmasambhava's teaching. She has the dharani of memory. Just like Ananda was able to remember all the Buddhist teachings, Yeshe Tsogyal plays that role, and she records it in this numinous Dakini script and hides it. And so Terma is really central to her identity. And then Yeshe Tsogyal as yogini, there's also different emphases in her biographies. So these are the two major biographical traditions of Yeshe Tsogyal. And Zhui Liang has actually traced all the traditions kind of stem and interrelate with these two famous exemplars. And I have the 17th century version kind of on the left first, because this is the first to be translated. It's the best known version of her life story, revealed in the 17th century, almost a millennia after she lived. Lady of the Lotus born. This is the one in which she engages in strict asceticism. She lives on nutrients derived from the plant life and the stones and the air and the water, a special practice called Julen. She meditates alone, and she gets sexually harassed. Like, you know, there's some realism here about what women face. And she actually has to stand down a crowd in Bhutan who's ready to shoot arrows at her, thinking she's a demoness. And she stands her ground and wins them over every time. In the second one, which is earlier, 14th century, by Drime Kunga, it's much more about her visionary journeys through Udayana, which is imagined as a pure land. And Yeshe Tsogyal fails again and again at the devotion that is exemplified in these pure realms. And it's quite interesting that in the end, it's her compassionate act that wins her entry into a tantric mandala to receive empowerment, not devotion. So if anybody knows anybody who's failed at devotion, there are other ways. So that's kind of just a brief sketch of her life and some of the ways that she can be an inspiration and role model. And now let's hear about Milarepa.
Well, there's some really interesting parallels in thinking about the biographical tradition of Milarepa. I think we could start with the premise of his historicity, and I'm reminded of a quip that famous scholar of the narrative traditions about the Buddha named John Strong, who once said, we know very little, and he was being kind here in saying we know very little about the Buddha of history. Really, we know nothing about the Buddha of history. What we know is about the Buddha of stories. We have many stories about the Buddha, and what we know about the Buddha comes from those stories and from the early archaeological record and other sources as well. When we think about the figure of Milarepa, everything that we know about his life, his activities, his transmissions comes from this slow development of a biographical tradition, which begins quite early and develops in rich and interesting ways. So I want to have us think about the literary tradition or the biographical tradition of Milarepa in thinking about an important turning point that takes place in the 15th century. So prior to the 15th century, and maybe beginning as soon as a generation or so after Milarepa died, there was an urge on the part of his followers to record something of his life. And some of the earliest records we have are the recordings not of the things that he did or where he traveled, but were of his spiritual poetry. In Tibetan, this is called gur, kind of songs of realization, as it's often been translated. But within, say, a generation or so, there were extensive compendia that were compilations of the poetry that he's said to have used as a vehicle for teaching, and then a very cursory record of the things that happened early in his life and then towards the end of his life as well. And those compendia could actually be quite extensive, and in some cases they were even more extensive than the version that we all know and love today. And so I've represented this early tradition, we left our slides here, by manuscript. This is a 15th century manuscript, but of an early literary tradition going back to I think the late 12th or 13th century. And this was a tradition known as the Black Treasury version. It was inspired by senior figures of Milarepa's later tradition known as the Karmapas. These were quite extensive. They were often handwritten manuscripts, and they were often illuminated. It may be hard to see because there's a lot of light in this room, but there's a beautiful illustration of the encounter of Milarepa and the huntsman from northern Nepal known as Kira Gompo Dorje. And his hunting dog and the deer bow before him, and Kira Gompo Dorje lays his bow and arrow and his weapons as offerings to Milarepa, becomes his disciple. So prior to the 15th century, representations of Milarepa were really tending towards the sort of the kind of collector spirit, trying to accumulate or compile all of the known stories associated with his life. But there wasn't really much regard for telling a good story. And in the late 15th century, that changes dramatically. Oops. And it changes with a figure many of you may be familiar with. His name is Tsongyön Heruka, the famous madman from Tsang. He was a great tantric practitioner who styled himself as after the great tantric siddhas of early India. He lived on the margins of society. Although he was trained as a monk, he gave up his monastic vows, spent years in meditation retreat. When he emerged from retreat, he was walking through the village naked, smeared with the ashes of cremated corpses, with fingers and toes from corpses wound into his dreadlocks, was presenting himself as a kind of tantric mad saint. And although he presented himself as this kind of madman, he was also a very astute writer and, you might say, producer of literature. So producing block print texts in the 15th century in Tibet was very expensive. And Tsongyön Heruka not only collected the stories of Milarepa, but was the first to actually print them in a form that was easily replicable. And by making them replicable, he could spread the story far and wide to the great centers of learning throughout central Tibet, sent them to the seats of his patrons in southwestern Tibet. It's one of the reasons why his version of the life story became the dominant story, really had to do with printing. And so I've given, well, we lost our slides here again. So I've represented this not with the block print edition that Tsongyön Heruka made in the late 15th century, but the earliest extant print edition from, about 40 years after that, 40 or 50 years after that. So this is from the early 16th century. And you can see this is illustrated in the far left-hand corner of the top manuscript. There's a representation of Milarepa. Tsongyön Heruka, as a literary stylist, was really brilliant. He really not only wanted to record all of the known sort of narratives associated with this figure, but wanted to tell a story in a way that had a kind of deep emotional value that resonated with its readers. And so one of the things he did, he transformed a story which had been told in a third-person narrative. Milarepa did this. He went from here to there. He taught this person. He transformed it into a first-person autobiography. So a first-person kind of self-narrated life story. And of course, we know that this is a fictional autobiography, but it's presented in an autobiographical voice nonetheless, and it creates a kind of emotional resonance to the reader. He also creates a kind of novelistic storyline that has an arc with the beginning where Milarepa, learns black magic, and it essentially becomes a mass murderer. Through his story of searching for a Dharma teacher, he eventually repents all of the sins of his youth. He finds his teacher in Marpa the translator, and then spends the remainder of his life in solitary meditation, wandering the Himalayan landscape and connecting with disciples, teaching them in the form of poetry. So it was really Tsongyön Heruka who created this emblematic figure, the figure who would become the iconic representation of what a renunciate should look like in the Himalayan world. That's really what became subsumed or encapsulated by Tsongyön Heruka's version. Another interesting feature about this version of the life story, it was modeled after traditional Tibetan representations of the Buddha's life. In Tibet, the Buddha's life often is framed within a series of 12 great acts or deeds that the Buddha performs. His birth in heaven, descending from heaven, his birth as a human, all the way up from his renunciation, his awakening, and his eventual death. And so Tsongyön Heruka very self-consciously mirrors the story of the Buddha in the telling of Milarepa's life. So maybe we should take this opportunity to turn now from thinking about the life story in literature to ways in which they kind of manifest beyond the written page.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's go to then manifestation in art and ritual. And since the slides are this way, why don't we just go this way? Whoops. Oh. What do you want to do? Do you want to go next, or do you want me to go next? We had this mix-up with our slides.
Sure. Why don't you start, since,
Okay.
since yours is the first
Okay.
slide.
We just, we kind of switched things, but forgot to switch the slideshow. All right. So really what we want to think about now is how do the life stories of these great masters come to life in new ways through art and ritual. And this is where in the title we're thinking about the afterlife of these different figures. So this image is actually Yumka Dechen Gyalmo, and this is Yeshe Tsogyal in the form of a tantric female deity or Dakini, in this case, Vajrayogini. So this is kind of amazing. It's a divinization of Yeshe Tsogyal. She transcends merely her human form as a great master and takes on this iconic female fierce deity and is then accessible through ritual to be supplicated, and not just supplicated. So this is the thing in Tibetan Buddhist ritual, is that you can do a visualization of a tantric deity out there and call on that deity for help, or a bodhisattva like Avalokiteshvara or Tara, please consider me. But you can also do a self-visualization. So in the case of the Yumka Dechen Gyalmo ritual, which was revealed by the great Terten or treasure revealer Jigme Lingpa in the 18th century, it's a self-visualization. So rather than Yeshe Tsogyal merely being a model in an abstract sense, the person doing the ritual is invited to become Yeshe Tsogyal. I mean, that's pretty radical. Not just, the human Yeshe Tsogyal, but the enlightened, timeless form, the symbolic or Samboka Kaya kind of manifestation. And I have found that the tendency to divinize female masters is really, really interesting. It's kind of a puzzle. The male tantric masters simply get to be accomplished, but maybe there's some discomfort with that. So, they must be Dakinis already. And Dakini, again, being this sort of female tantric deity. So this elevation of Yeshe Tsogyal in some way fits that model. And what we then find is that liturgy or ritual is one mechanism for Yeshe Tsogyal's ongoing presence for Tibetans. And really, when doing this kind of self-visualization or any kind of visualization, one is shaping one's mind into a specific form of enlightenment and therefore trying to cultivate those qualities. So in this case, it's the shape of Vajrayogini, but the understanding that it is Yeshe Tsogyal manifesting. This is a method for both women and men. So very important that Yeshe Tsogyal is an inspiration and an object of devotion for, all Tibetans and all Tibetan Buddhists, as Buddhism is now becoming transnational. So, and you see some of the lake here we'll come back to. May reference Tsogyal Lhotso, her birthplace, and where this particular ritual was revealed. But let's hear more about Milarepa.
So interesting. I mean, you find Milarepa as the subject of very similar kind of visualization practices. And in this context, it's in the practice of what's referred to as guru yoga, which is not only a supplication to one's spiritual teacher, to one's guru, but an actual merging of oneself, of one's own mind, with the guru's mind. And Milarepa becomes the center of a specific form of guru yoga practice. But what I thought we'd reflect on here in thinking about the intersection of the life story of Milarepa and the practice of ritual is in the consecration of art. So I've long been interested in visual representations of Tibetan masters, and especially of the figure of Milarepa and the development of his unique iconography. And as I spent many years looking at especially Thangka paintings, a traditional Tibetan hanging scroll painting, was something that very few people ever commented on, which is looking at the reverse. So if you look at the reverse of most Thangka paintings, you'll find usually some kind of inscription. And that inscription is a kind of trace or a mark of a very specific kind of ritual practice. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the practice of consecration. And in the Buddhist world, consecration is the ritual practice or performance of consecration is the ritual that transforms an inert representation of a figure, such as the Buddha or Milarepa, to the living presence of that figure. So a painting of Milarepa might be just a static image, but once it's been consecrated, it becomes the living embodiment of Milarepa as a social being that has a kind of religious power similar to standing in the presence of that figure himself. So Bob Scharf, someone who's worked on Buddhist images in Japanese Buddhism, once said that to stand before a consecrated image of the Buddha was to stand before the Buddha himself. This is a very powerful kind of idea in traditional Buddhist practice. And so we return to this specific image here. As I was looking at the kinds of consecrations that were performed on portraits or visual representations of Milarepa, were a unique form of consecration. So normally a consecration would be a series of seed syllables at the place of the body, speech, and mind. Sometimes there were a few other kind of short inscriptions, a line of verse, something like that. And what I started to notice repeatedly over and over again were these very extensive inscriptions. And not only were they long, they were also shaped in a very particular way. And if you look carefully at the inscriptions, so the painting here is a very beautiful representation of Milarepa in front of a mountain. It's been theorized this is Mount Kailash, one of the places where Milarepa is said to have practiced meditation. And on the right-hand side, you see the inscription on the back. And the inscription here, two things stand out. One, it's a very extensive inscription. And two, it's shaped very clearly in the form of a stupa, a Buddhist reliquary. So I spent a long time transcribing and translating this text, and it turns out that the inscription here actually is a kind of biography. It tells the life story of Milarepa in verse. It's very beautiful. It goes very systematically through the early part of his life. It summarizes all of the events in which he gained disciples, met disciples, and taught them through song. There's a section at the end about his death. It's very beautiful and very poetic, but it's very clear that it's a version of his life story. And it got me wondering, what does it mean to write a biographical narrative on the back of a painting that no one would ever see? Right? This is on the back of a painting that would be up against a temple wall or the wall of a personal shrine. So no one would ever read this. That the biography serves a different kind of purpose. And I think in this context, it serves a very specific ritual purpose. And that is the life story as a whole serves the function of a kind of relic. So relics, of course, were the physical remains of the Buddha or other great masters after they died that were used to empower or to consecrate a stupa or a statue. In this case, it's not a corporeal relic, but a literary relic, a relic that embodies the entire life that Milarepa lived. And that then becomes amplified or magnified by the shape in which it's drawn. So if we can pull the slide up again, you see that it's shaped as a stupa. And if you imagine looking through the back of the painting to the front, and you superimpose one over the other, you actually see a visual depiction of what's going on here. That is the physical body of Milarepa, interred within the stupa formed by the words of his life. And so this is one way in which the story of Milarepa's life was not really meant to be read, but serves instead as a kind of relic, as a powerful remainder of the teacher who's now absent. So one very different example of the way in which Milarepa's life story has been encapsulated in the practice of ritual. This is another manuscript from a small village temple in central Bhutan. It's very beautiful, and it's a short, sort of condensed version of a text many of you are probably familiar with. That's the Kagyu Gortso, often translated as the Ocean of Kagyu Songs, or the Rain of Wisdom, if you know the classic translation published in the 70s by Chogyam Trungpa and some of his disciples. This is instead a kind of greatest hits collection of the songs of figures in the lineage from Milarepa on down. So the forefathers of this tradition that flows from Milarepa, known as the Kagyu tradition. But what we find in this collection is not just the record of the poems themselves, but this intricate blending of the songs themselves as written down, but also the specific Tibetan notation for how to perform them, how to chant them. Because, of course, the songs were never meant only to be read, but to be performed. And we know that the Kagyu Gortso yearly in many of the monasteries of Milarepa's tradition, they actually do this as a kind of ritual recitation. They'll sit together, the assembly will come together and recite over many days all of the songs in this collection. And so we see the notation for how to chant these songs that show the pitch and modulation of one's voice as each syllable is notated. That's the middle folio. And yet there's another kind of aspect to the ritual practice here, and that is the imagination of the location in which this song actually took place. So the manuscript is filled with these wonderful illuminations that describe the activity that serves as the context for where the song was originally performed. So in this case, the central figure in robes is Marpa, Milarepa's main teacher. And you see a small figure of Milarepa on the right-hand side as he's singing to his teacher in song a vision that he has in a dream called the Four Pillars. This was a prophetic vision of the four great disciples that would flow from Marpa, of whom Milarepa is one. And so you see a fusing of the content of the song, the performance of the song, and the kind of visual imagination. It serves as a kind of aesthetic of devotion as performed that comes through the kind of multitude of senses. It's a very unique sort of example of this kind of thing, but I think a really provocative way or evocative way of thinking about the way that Milarepa's life continues through the imagination and recitation of events associated with his life. So I think this takes us to our final section here, Holly, and maybe you could say a little bit about, you already highlighted the lake that was associated with Yeshe Tsogyal's life. And I know that is a place that is now still visited and is part of a ritual and pilgrimage tradition. So do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first, just to recall that Yeshe Tsogyal becomes this kind of authoritative antecedent for other female Buddhist masters in Tibet. And this is a contemporary couple, Khandro Thare Lamo and Namchul Rinpoche, that I have done research and written about. And Khandro Thare Lamo is considered an emanation of Yeshe Tsogyal. So Yeshe Tsogyal doesn't only live on in her ritual or the visions that great masters have about her or in the landscape, which we'll talk about in a moment, but in actual figures up to the present, great female masters who are recognized as Yeshe Tsogyal.
So I would just add that it's not very well known, but there are numerous incarnations of Milarepa as well. Mm-hmm. They're not very well known today. There are several living figures who are understood as living emanations or reincarnations of Milarepa. But we know historically that there were individuals who recognized themselves as reincarnations or in the lineage of rebirths stemming from Milarepa.
Mm-hmm. Right, and these are more kind of loose, these emanations, rather than the tulku system where, at the death of one great lama, they find the child who is the reincarnation. These are a little bit more loose, the emanational system, but great figures like Mingyur Paldron of the Mindroling lineage in the 18th century, or Sarah Khandro in the early 20th century, also women in the Nyingma tradition that are recognized as Yeshe Tsogyal. And so this couple, both were tertons, or treasure revealers, so they participate in this tradition of terma, of revealing these texts by Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche's teachings that Yeshe Tsogyal set down. And they include, actually quite extraordinarily, 3 volumes of sadhanas or rituals to female deities. So there's a great emphasis, including sadhanas, of Yeshe Tsogyal. This couple played a really important role in the Buddhist revival after the devastation of the Cultural Revolution. So China invading Tibet in the 1950s, the utter decimation of monasteries, the imprisonment of great lamas, and just the wholesale destruction of a culture. And out of this, the surviving masters rebuilt everything from the bottom up. An incredibly potent time of revitalization starting in the 1980s. And one of the ways they did that was through terma, through a kind of memory that allowed them to remember back to the very source of Buddhism in Tibet, to retrieve a continuity after this period of rupture. And they actually viewed their terma revelation as kind of medicine to heal the damage of degenerate times. That's a sort of metaphor that they used. And they also played an important role in restoring the birthplace of Yeshe Tsogyal. So this is in central Tibet, Tsogyal Lhotso. And to the left, you see this spring that is understood to be her spirit or soul, her life force bubbling forth across time. So the potency, again, that was gestured to and discussed this morning in the panel with Tsering Yangzom Lama and Dawa Lokitsang and Natalie Avalos about land-based religion. And I think with the emphasis on Buddhist philosophy, as Buddhism kind of came into academic study and also into, interest in the 70s among practitioners and the beginning of Buddhism in the West, or not the beginning, but the sort of seed of Tibetan Buddhism in the West, you see this interest in Buddhist philosophy, which is a textual bias, which is really about the mind and not about a more embodied land-based practice that is coming to the fore now, is so central to Tibetan Buddhism. And here is an example. And pilgrimage is a practice to these sites that carry the potency and blessing. It's not just an abstract philosophy. It's a power in place. So this, and it's right here under the tree that actually Jigme Lingpa sat, and in deep meditation, and then these symbolic scripts started to appear above the lake. So this is where he revealed the ritual dedicated to Yeshe Tsogyal, the Yumka Dechen Gyalmo. So again, adding another layer of sanctity to the site. And this nunnery, was really decimated, and Khandro Thare Lama and her partner Namchul Rinpoche visited many times, supported the nuns, helped them rebuild initially. And then this nunnery, now this particular structure is pretty new, 2015. And in another kind of dimension, a transnational dimension of Tibetan Buddhism, there is a group called Jnana Sukha, and a lama called Dechen Yeshe Wangmo, who's American, and they actually sponsored in 2017 these incredible murals at the in this assembly hall at Tsogyal Lhotso. And there are 9 images of Yeshe Tsogyal's life story. And there is a precedent for murals of the lives of Milarepa and other great masters, but not so much Yeshe Tsogyal. And so this is like really amazing and beautiful, beautiful artwork. And it just shows how Yeshe Tsogyal's importance and her presence continues to be vibrant and alive, and also garner more resources, more interest, and more ability to really preserve and augment that.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the issue of space and place, because we know that one of the functions of sacred biography, especially in the Tibetan Buddhist world, is the claiming and reclaiming the organization, or what is sometimes I've thought of as the landscaping of place. That is the transformation of a kind of ordinary landscape into a sacred landscape. And we know that that was certainly one of the functions, I think the intentional functions, of Tsongyen Haruka's sort of classic version of Milarepa's life story. One of the things he did was reorder the landscape of places associated with Milarepa, created whole new networks of sacred sites that led to the formation of pilgrimage rituals and things like that. Over the past, we're competing here. So over the past 3 decades or so, I've been slowly documenting many of the sites associated with Milarepa, both in Tibet and Nepal, across the Tibetan Buddhist world. And what's so interesting is we not only have the canonical places, many of which are mentioned in the life stories themselves, but there's now a contemporary tradition of recovering, of identifying, quote unquote, new sites, or sites newly associated with Milarepa. And many of these are taking place in Nepal. So about 10 years ago, I was visiting a pilgrimage region just north of Kathmandu that's mostly associated with Hindu pilgrimage, a series of lakes called Gosai Kund. Perhaps some of you have been there. And when I was up there, I first encountered that small temple on the right that was a new temple, a mandir, that the local people told me was called the Buddha Mandir, but actually it was not dedicated to the Buddha, but dedicated to the figure of Milarepa. And this was on a small pass overlooking the border. You're looking off into the distance north to Tibet here, but is identifying a series of, or is marking a series of visionary experience that was actually held by a visiting Thai Buddhist monk in the 1990s, who, as he was meditating in this area, had visions of Milarepa. That was then sort of replicated and, you might say, authenticated by local lamas who had similar visions. And they then established, you see on the spot on the left, which is now considered to be a meditation site of Milarepa himself, right next to the lake or one of the lakes of Gosai Kund. So the establishment of a new meditation place outside of the quote-unquote canon. And what's interesting now is that if you look at the tourism and trekking guides of this area, they now start to talk about these places of Milarepa as kind of attractions for coming to visit these locations. And of course, we know that tourism and pilgrimage were intertwined, for centuries. So I thought we'd end here by thinking about the performative traditions associated with Milarepa. And of course, there's a lot to say about this. There are the contemporary films of Milarepa's life. There are comic book versions of Milarepa's life. But I thought we would end by thinking about a very traditional Tibetan Buddhist ritual performance, and that is cham, a kind of monastic dance. And these take many forms, but there is a particular cham dance that's associated with an episode from Milarepa's life, and that's his encounter with the hunter, with Kira Gompo Dorje. And so this is a photograph taken by my dear friend and colleague, Françoise Pomeray, who's lived and worked in Bhutan for most of her life, from a cham in Paro, in southern Bhutan, and you can see the figure of Milarepa on the right-hand side wearing the white robes, and Kira Gompo Dorje in the background, and there's a deer in the center. So it's one performance, one traditional reenactment of his life story. But of course, we find contemporary versions of this as well. There is a new stage play that was written by the 17th Karmapa that's been performed several times, most recently before the pandemic in New York, and here you see a still. It's an actor wearing the classic white robe of Milarepa. And then finally, this is the libretto for a Western opera based on Milarepa's life that was also performed in New York City just before the pandemic, called Mila, Great Sorcerer. And it's this amazing blend of the Western musical and performative form of opera, together with the story that comes from the Tibetan tradition, the classic version of Milarepa's life, but also fusing in the incorporation of traditional Tibetan Buddhist instruments. So this was a libretto, a musical score written by Andrea Clearfield. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. So we want to give you all an opportunity for questions and comments. So why don't we turn to that next? So the floor is now yours.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, behind me. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, so right here in the front.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Very excellent. Very much enjoyed it. I have a question about the ritual practice described having to do with the merging with the deity or the subject. Is that a practice that's also found in Hinduism, or is that unique to Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes, so the practice of visualization meditation or deity yoga is something which you find sort of, across Indian traditions, but it really comes to its fulfillment, in a sense, within the practice of Tantra. And of course, there are Jain Tantras, there are Hindu Tantras, and it's really in the Buddhist Tantras, which get transmitted throughout Buddhist Asia and part to East Asia, but become the sort of dominant centerpiece of Tibetan Buddhism, where it really comes to the fore. So it's often described that Tibetan Buddhism really is focused from the very beginning on the cultivation of the powers of creative visualization, of the visual or imagined transformation of one's body into the body of a deity, and the landscape around you into the landscape of the mandala. That's at the very center of Tibetan Buddhist meditation practice, of many Tibetan Buddhist meditation practice, really at the very center. So right here in the front.
I'm curious, how do the accounts of the saints and female saints that you've encountered, how do the accounts of their effect on their worshipers compare to the accounts in more current times of living saints? What impressions, what effects have living saints, let's say, had on you in your visits to India? Is it the same? Has it changed? Has it evolved?
It's interesting when we think about the tradition of saints and gurus and mystics and skeptics across Himalaya, across the Tibetan Plateau, across the Buddhist world, but also, around the world, So there are a lot of similarities in some sense. The desire for contact with either the saint themselves or their relics, right? The idea of pilgrimage in which one follows in the footsteps of a great figure to gain some kind of blessing or some kind of connection, right? Through materiality, through place. In European, medieval Christendom, people wanting to kiss relics, right? Wanting to have that contact, physical contact. And so when you think about the living tradition of great masters today, of which there are many, I think we still see this tremendous charisma, this tremendous wanting to, have direct contact, like people who meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and just feel, it's kind of a mixture of sort of Buddhist ideas of blessing through contact and, frankly, celebrity culture, right? That we want to meet that special person. And I think, what happens is that then organizations develop around a charismatic centerpiece. And I think one of the challenges, in Tibetan Buddhism, these great masters were really anchored in long-standing traditions in which the monasteries and laity, the yogic practitioners and laity, all had very ongoing close relationships over generations. And that has largely been refurbished in Tibetan areas. I mean, really, against tremendous odds. Tibetans have rebuilt not only the monasteries, but the network of relationships between the laity and the monks. One of my students in the audience, Tsogyal, is working on this topic. But I think in the West, it's a little tricky because you have these very charismatic lamas, these living masters who gather a lot of people around them without the anchoring in the tradition and the anchoring in the long-standing multi-generational lay and monastic or lay and yogic traditions. And so it gets a little tricky. Actually, things have can go off the rails. And so I think it's really important to see how charisma and the idea of wanting to be close to and have physical proximity to a living saint. Amanda Lucia, who works on Hinduism in South Asia, talks about this, is a very important type of religiosity. And as these traditions become transnational, we just have to really think about how they re-embed themselves in new contexts, and especially with really healthy ethics around them.
There's a question here.
I was actually going to ask about that. How are these two figures, right? How do they manifest in contemporary times in terms of how do people engage them? Holly, you kind of got into it a little bit in terms of Namtrul Rinpoche and Dalai Lama in terms of how they, you talked about it a little bit, if you can go in a little bit more in terms of how do they use these figures to kind of reframe their context? How do they talk about it in their situation, and how do they use these figures to kind of enact new things? So both of you, if you can give us some actual examples of how these figures become embodied and enacted on.
Yeah, really happy to. Thank you. What a beautiful question, Dawa. Yeah. So one of the ways that Terma functioned in terms of the Buddhist revival in Tibet, for example, Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, who is also in the same area of Golok as Khandro Dalai Lama was, really would discover Terma at a site and basically reawaken the cultural memory of the long-standing history of all the great masters who had practiced at that site. And Khandro Dalai Lama and Namtrul Rinpoche did the same thing. They would reveal a ritual implement at a Gesar site and suddenly activate the memory of Gesar of Ling, this great king of eastern Tibet. And actually they wrote another chapter of his epic, which is one of the longest, if not the longest epic in the world. So each of these kinds of moments of revelation is not only from their own memory, this special kind of memory that is, I liked how Tsereng Yangzom Lama referred to it as psychic, this kind of psychic memory that goes to really across the centuries, but they're also reawakening the memory, the cultural memory, and the kind of, and reactivating sacred sites that had been desecrated through the Chinese invasion, and through, sometimes these soldiers would actually deliberately, stay in a sacred cave that great masters had practiced at, and literally desecrate them. And so it's like this recovery process and reactivation through their rituals, through their pilgrimage, and through their revelations.
So I'm thinking of a few examples. This is a great question, by the way, and very quickly because we're almost out of time. But I'm thinking of a few examples that relate to sacred place, but aren't really in the Terma tradition. And I'm thinking specifically about the sites associated with Milarepa in Nepal. So there are several regions in Yomo, and Tsum, and Nubri, regions with a well-established, a deeply felt, unique cultural identity and practice, history and legacy. And the peoples of those areas have begun to assert or reassert their own unique cultural values, their unique cultural identity, in part to stand against the hegemony of the Hindu kingdom of Nepal that lasted for many generations. And as they've reawakened their own sense of their own cultural uniqueness, have used the places, the sacred sites associated with those regions in Yomo, the sacred place of meditation cave of Milarepa, and also in Tsum and Nubri. Those places have become sort of cornerstones of their own sort of cultural landscape, if you will. So in a certain, and that's also true of Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyal, and you also find Yeshe Tsogyal places all over northern Nepal as well. And so I think sacred sites are another example of the ways in which landscape are so deeply tied to the kind of inner lives of the inhabitants of those regions. So thanks for asking that. So do we have time for one more, or are we done?
I think we're at it.
Okay, so I think we're at the end. So thank you all for lasting through the end of the day.